If you're joining us, we're just waiting for a few more people to get on, and then we'll get started. Well, hello, I'm Kathryn Jean Lopez from the National Review Institute, and I'm here with Lewis Brown. Lewis is the executive director of Christ Medicus Foundation, is a lawyer, has worked in government, and Lewis, thank you for joining us. Could you start? So we wanted to come together today and talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and his relevance for us today. And it was amazing rereading some of his sermons and speeches. One of the sense I always have of Martin Luther King is his rootedness in Christ, and that you cannot understand Martin Luther King without God and the cross, and so he has so much to say about suffering. He has so much to say about divides, and maybe one of the most important things besides Christ that jumped out as I was rereading so much is in the I Have a Dream speech, he clearly says no to bitterness. And we're like the bitterest people right now, it seems. And so with that, Lewis, could you tell people a little bit of your story as a former Democratic staffer who walked away from Democratic politics because of the abortion issue, right?
Sure.
Which is core to equality to you, and just so people understand a little bit about where you're coming from.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Kathryn, and thanks for having me. It's always good to talk with you on these issues. I wish we were talking in a better time for the country, but I think I know, because of my faith in God and faith in what God is doing in his people here in the United States, I'm still hopeful. There may be harder times ahead, but I know that love, truth, justice, mercy await us if we can persevere in the truth and in the love, which is the source of all of our freedoms and all of our liberations for every person. I was born and raised in Michigan, eventually became an attorney, went to Howard University School of Law, became an attorney in private practice for a while, and had been involved in Democratic politics in various places, in school, a little bit after college, while in law school, various an internship and externship, practice, and then went to work at the DNC. And at a certain point, I just could not continue with that work. My coming into politics, like most people in our country, Kathryn, was a coming into politics out of a desire to improve the lives of our fellow citizens, a desire to improve the common good, to make the nation better. So much of how I identified in terms of making the nation better was looking at the work of Dr. King, looking at the history and the legacy of President John Kennedy, looking at the history and the legacy of Robert Kennedy. And I felt for much of my young life that I could best advance the common good and make our country better as a Democrat. I had a conflict because of the abortion issue. I was always pro-life, grew in my awareness of the importance of the life issue, came to understand that the taking of an unborn life isn't just a destruction of a clump of cells, but it's an actual destruction of a human life. It's actual murder. And had hoped that I could change the Democratic Party on the life issue inside out, from the inside out, and working with a lot of, in my opinion, good people on the Democratic side of the aisle, a lot of good people who have good intentions. I think they're wrong about some things, particularly about the life issue, wrong about some serious things, including the life issue, but they're also right about some things. And but I just had a conflict where, in good conscience, I couldn't move forward working at the DNC because of the life issue, and moved on. Eventually worked for a state Catholic conference, working on issues of immigration and trying to pass in-state tuition, to get in-state tuition for the undocumented young people in the state of in the state of Maryland, actually, is where I worked. I was able to be, by the grace of God, a part of a team of many people, a large team of people that was able to get in-state tuition for undocumented high school students in the state of Maryland. Also co-led a coalition to pass housing non-discrimination legislation, which happened many years later after I left. And then also worked on healthcare at that state Catholic conference. Moved on, worked for a California congressman working on healthcare, working on issues that came before the House Judiciary Committee. I wasn't a House Judiciary Committee staffer, but was his liaison there, and eventually went back to practice and then went to the Christ Medicus Foundation, where I really was able to use a lot of my awareness and skills, by the grace of God, about making Christ-centered care, the love of God that occurs when one receives Christ-centered medical care, available to folks that are materially poor, that are particularly vulnerable, and to protect our religious freedom, our right to love others in the process, and to make that care available to the least among us. Served at HHS for a time, and that was a gift, and came back to the Christ Medicus Foundation, really to share this love of Christ, the love of God, which I think is the most powerful force in human history, a love which Martin Luther King also agreed was the most powerful force in human history, and to do that in healthcare. I think before this year, a lot of people didn't understand how vital these issues of the dignity of the human person, access to medical care, that right to medical care, how important all of those things are within the context of the right to life of every person from conception to natural death. After this pandemic, after going through COVID, now everyone understands the vital importance of protecting the health, the life and health of every person as much as we possibly can, but doing it in a way which honors their human dignity. And that is much of the mission of the Christ Medicus Foundation and much of my personal mission.
Well, and part of why I wanted you to talk a little bit about yourself there is because your story, the way you approach things is integrated, as we're
I'm trying.
supposed to be. Well, you were all on a journey, right?
Right.
And hopefully encouraging one another along the way in doing that. But what has been striking to me over the last year is obviously the obviousness of our universal vulnerability, and people in need of identity, that they feel comfortable with,
Right.
We see it playing out in politics and with signs and with, and the fact of the matter is that if we believed that Black lives matter and all lives matter, we'd be living the Beatitudes in a more rigorous way.
Right.
It's not about one issue. It's about, and I did want to start out making that, letting you tell your story about abortion, because I've always felt this way, but I increasingly do. I mean, all the violence, and it's on both sides, all sides, no sides,
Right.
And the bitterness again, and it all comes down to the fact that we kill the unborn,
Yeah,
and when you can break that bond between mother and child and almost feel comfortable about it,
Right.
It's in our laws. It's we've done a huge injustice to all of humanity, by accepting this.
Right. And I think I saw an image of Mother Teresa just as I was preparing and before we started just a few minutes ago. And I remember the words of Mother Teresa, who is a person that really lived it. Mother Teresa cared for some of the most vulnerable people in all of human society, for those that were in India that were really suffering and that were really struggling. And she saw the lack of respect, the lack of a witness to their dignity, and she moved into the breach to witness to that dignity, to share the love that those folks are entitled to because they are children and creatures of God. And even in that, even in seeing the extraordinary degradation, the deprivations in the human condition, and in the conditions that those people were afforded, as much as she saw that suffering, she still believed and spoke about how the greatest violation of the human person, the greatest violation of human rights, was the destruction of the unborn child in the womb. And that should help wake us up. If we, as many have said before, if we can't get the protection of the most vulnerable, the unborn, innocent unborn child in the mother's womb, if we can't get that right, we're really going to struggle as a society and as a people to get the rights and the dignity and the love that others deserve outside of the womb, to get that right too. And so we have to, those of us who are Christians, people of goodwill that subscribe to a Judeo-Christian worldview generally, we have our policy and political differences, but we have to approach these things, particularly through a Christian identity, through Judeo-Christian identity, as we seek to protect the unborn, protect African-American and Hispanic folks in communities that are particularly vulnerable because of historical racial conditions or because of present day discrimination. As we seek to protect and provide for rural white folks in different areas across the country that aren't benefiting from the riches and the wealth of our nation. We have to seek justice, to seek that truth, to seek the love of the human person at every single stage. And as much as unfortunately, what's happened too in our country, I think, Kathryn, part of the problem is while so many of us fight for the unborn, which we absolutely should, and I've spent a lot of my adult life fighting for the unborn, we can't turn a blind eye to other injustices, to other types of discrimination, right? As other people have a particular concern about the need for criminal justice reform, about instances of police brutality or a bias within our criminal justice system, which definitely still exists. We can't turn a blind eye to other forms of justice, of injustice and discrimination and the undermining of human dignity. So we have to take this holistic approach. God may call us in different places, but we have to try to be as consistent as we possibly can, if we truly believe that every single human person is endowed with inalienable rights from their creator and required and entitled to that witness to the love and the dignity that they deserve.
I agree entirely. And is it Pollyannish to think that there's room for common ground and unity at this time of such division? There are a lot of people on the left who say that, it's pro-life to be pro-immigrant and it's pro-life to be X, Y, and Z. And so I hear similarities in what you're saying, right? But then the problem is, but you have to be for the unborn child if you're pro-life. That's like,
right. Right. That's a
prerequisite for the title. And
right.
so there has to be, some recognition of that. And is there a way, because there are so many issues, criminal justice reform and paid family leave,
right,
and even on the life issues, adoption and foster care, right? Why can't we work together on these things? And presumably, in my heart and my prayers, people would come around on abortion too. But on both sides, how do we get to a place where we can really have a movement of real concern for the vulnerable? And
sure.
in the tradition of Martin Luther King, I mean, one thing that's striking to me is, when you look at both the right and the left today, there are these elements on the right where we can't trust the election and we can't trust the media and nobody can be trusted, right? And so that leads to people doing desperate things like we saw at the Capitol, right? And then you have on the left this sense that that it's systematic, right? And so again, can't trust the institutions.
Right.
And how do we operate? You know, Martin Luther King talks so much about, you know, not wallowing in despair, not being bitter, and being realistic about the fact that there are real injustices. But you like you were saying before, you persevere in the truth with love. You know, you don't blow things up. You know.
Right. I think we have to start, Kathryn, from the reality that love is what we all are made for. It is the highest good. And it is the precondition for human freedom, for true, authentic human freedom, right? Love is necessary for true, authentic human freedom. And that's the number one thing that we must do. The number one objective is that awareness that love is what we're made for and it is what we seek. I think the second thing, and Arthur Brooks has talked about this very well in various venues, we have to reject the temptation to assume that people that disagree with us are evil. It's not true. You know, some people wind up committing, doing things that are despicable and horrible, right? But the overwhelming majority of Americans, and particularly people that are advocating for the unborn and advocating for, you know, conservative principles, and the majority of people that are advocating for immigrants and criminal justice reform and the reality that Black lives do matter, those folks do not have evil intention. They're seeking good things, much of which overlap, some of which don't. There are real differences. But we can't assume that the intentions and motivations of those that disagree with us are evil. That's overwhelmingly just false. It's not true. We, as many have said before, we used to assume in this country that those that disagreed with us were just wrong. That perhaps even that they were trying to get to something appearing to be the same place that perhaps I am, perhaps that you are, perhaps that anyone else is, but they're just wrong in how to get there. Now, too many in our country just assumes that the other side, so to speak, is evil. And so, you know, there is nothing wrong. And I think many ways it's appropriate to want to have greater protections and seek non-discrimination and seek inclusion for undocumented immigrants in the United States. To me, it's definitely needed, right? We also need that criminal justice reform and to be aware of and seek justice in the reality that there is still a discrimination, particularly in minority communities towards Hispanic and African American men and women. And I'm sick and tired and so pained by seeing all the instances of police brutality. It shouldn't be overstated. It's not the 70s, it's not the 80s, it's not the 90s, it's not the 60s, but it's still an issue. And those people are coming from good places. And in great part, I'm in solidarity with them. At the same time, we as Christians should be in solidarity that want to love the immigrant, that want to protect our Black and brown brothers and sisters from police brutality. At the same time, I think that people that had concerns, questions about the election and were peacefully protesting, peacefully voicing those concerns, that's also a legitimate form of expression and part of our constitutional rights. And even I would say in certain cases that people had serious concerns are obligations. But those folks that share those type of concerns, that feel motivated to speak out, to protest peacefully, there's so much more when you really break it down that those folks have in common. And then you add in the life issue. So much more than those have in common. I would say in reality, very little that they disagree with. So we have to start from the principle of love, which is what Dr. King so often talked about. And he went back to Aquinas. He went back to the great African saint, Saint Augustine, right? Particularly if you look at a letter from a Birmingham jail, which I just went through last week, much of it, he's trying to bring together that Christian continuity about the truth of the human person, about the truth of love, about truth as truth, about where we get to, how we get to human freedom, and bringing those things together: love, truth, freedom, and perhaps hating the sin, but not hating the sinner, and rejecting the temptation that is clearly there, both on the extreme right, the extreme left, or whatever one wants to call it. There's a great temptation on both sides of the political spectrum to just hate the opponent. That has to be rejected. That has to be condemned.
I was rereading A Knock at Midnight, that sermon from Martin Luther King, and I felt like he was preaching to me, and to all of us. It's midnight in our world, and the darkness is so deep that we can hardly see which way to turn. He says that almost always the creative, dedicated minority has made the world better. That gave me some hope too. And he talked about the traveler's deep longing for the bread of love. Everybody wishes to love and be loved. He who feels that he is not loved feels that he does not count. And that's so much of what we're seeing in the streets and in our politics, right? Mm-hmm. Midnight is a confusing hour when it's difficult to be faithful, that's for sure. And then there's a little warning, not a little warning, a warning to the church, which I take to mean all Christians.
Sure.
Church, and I add to it too, as you do, and people of goodwill, The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. And then he goes on, if the church does not participate actively in the struggle for peace and for economic and racial justice, it will forfeit the loyalty of millions and cause men everywhere to say that it has atrophied its will.
That's key. And a portion of what you read, I saw at a Jesuit church in downtown Detroit, St. Peter and Paul, years ago. I haven't been there in a long, long time. And it's what he's saying there is vital. I think that in any election, in any presidential election, my perspective as a Catholic and as a Christian is that our country is better off when we have a president that respects and protects life and dignity from conception to natural death. Okay, that's what I believe. And that has been that's where my hopefully it's well-formed conscience takes me when I pray and when I think and study about these things. However, what a particular problem that many have fallen into in our country, too many good people, is seeking a political solution for these problems, particularly as Christians, right? As I thought about the political problems that the early Christian church faced throughout the Roman Empire and what the pagan Romans at the time were doing, I cannot imagine. I mean, the things that were being done, unspeakable evils in the early first 100 years of the church in the Roman Empire, particularly before Constantine, and they persevered. They persevered in love. They provided an extraordinary witness to the love of God. They served the needs of the most vulnerable. They served the needs of the poor. And they weren't ultimately seeking a political solution. Political solutions have its place, but they were seeking a spiritual solution. They were seeking to change hearts and minds through the infinitely powerful love of Christ, of the love of Jesus Christ, the love of God. And on a certain level, that brought down the moral evils, that brought down the wickedness. And so as we have a appropriate obligation as Christians, as people of goodwill, to seek just political solutions, and we can disagree about them, we should first keep our eyes on advancing the gospel, as Dr. King did. The last words that he spoke publicly in one of my favorite speeches of his is, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord, right? And so he didn't even see really the fruits of his labor, right? He didn't appeal to people about voting this way or voting that way. Again, it has its place. He appealed to the hearts and the minds and the consciences of the Christian community and of the American community. And that's what we as Christians have to do a better job, whether we're Democrats, whether Republicans, I would say myself included. The social ills of our nation will be solved through spiritual renewal. And there's precedent about that. I would say that without the Great Awakening, without so many Catholic immigrants coming over into our country, you would not have, without the faith, the extraordinary faith of my grandfathers and my grandmothers that were from the South, that were from Louisiana and Mississippi and Oklahoma, they would not, African Americans wouldn't have persevered without faith in God. They wouldn't have made it through slavery. Our white brothers and sisters in the South were seated with Christianity, which allowed the civil rights movement to prevail over their consciences. The North was seated with Christianity, which allowed them to see how wrong their treatment, even in the North, was of African Americans, and allowed white Southerners to see how wrong their treatment of African Americans was through the Jim Crow South. It wasn't because we voted in 5 million Democrats or 5 million Republicans. It was that spiritual, cultural renewal. And that's what we have to get back to. It's much harder. We may not see it in this lifetime, but we have to get back as Christians and people of goodwill to that spiritual renewal, that Christian humanism for every person, and away from an overly partisan view of the world and an overdependence on political solutions for ultimately spiritual and human needs.
I have a statue of Dorothy Day behind me, and I was just rereading some of her. I've been in the process of rereading some of her things, and she's sort of viewed as this, left-wing anti-war person, but the core of her life was her relationship with Christ and living the Beatitudes. And when you start, and Martin Luther King was all about the gospel and the Beatitudes. And when you start to, remember what they are, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, right? The clean in heart, the merciful, the peacemakers, it's such a reminder that, if we're hating the people who disagree with us politically, whether they're on, they could be conservatives that you disagree with, or they could be liberals that, if you're hating them, if you're, not bringing humility to the table, if you're seeking salvation through politics,
Right, that's right.
It's all going to go wrong.
It's all going to go wrong. That's exactly right. And, as I think that just speaking personally, I know that you pray. I pray. I attempt to be pious. In my greatest moments, I know how weak I am and totally dependent upon Jesus Christ to do anything that is good. And I often have a righteous anger about the reality of abortion in our country. I see attacks on religious freedom. I see the attacks on the family that have really undermined and decimated so many African American communities in particular, and in the Northeast and in the Midwest. And I get very righteously angry. But at the same time, a lot of those folks that may be responsible for some of those policies had good intentions. A lot of times those folks were misguided. And a lot of times, I probably in my past have supported policies or political solutions that were not the best. And then I think in my greatest moments, I'm reminded that for those of us that are baptized Christians, regardless of wherever we may be on the political spectrum, we all contributed to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, all of us equally, on a certain level. And then truth is truth, but it's not because Lewis Brown, because I'm great, right? And I think we need to do a better job. I had serious concerns about this election and the process, and still do. But Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to be president and vice president on Wednesday. And we as Christians need to pray for them and cooperate and collaborate with them on the good things they do and call them out on the things that they should not be doing. And we should, as we approach people that have different political perspectives than we do, we need to be approaching them out of love of God and love of that person that we encounter. And if we're motivated by anything else, then we're failing and we need to check ourselves. That's the reality that we need to be operating out of. That's the reality that Christ calls us to. That's the reality that the Jewish prophets called us to. And that's how we need to be operating. And the beauty is, Kathryn, if I could say this too, is if I wake up every morning as a Christian and say, God, you love me, I don't deserve it, praise God. You came to free me. I am free. I am liberated through your love. I am liberated through the opportunity that I have each day to love each person I encounter. If I live in that reality of love as an heir to a kingdom of eternal happiness and joy, if I live each day through that reality, I am free, I am liberated, I am joyful, and there's no room for hate. There's no room for prejudice. There's no room for discrimination. And I can operate freely. That's part of what needs to be recovered too, is that we are heirs to this incredible kingdom. And if we live in the love that Christ gives us, we live in the love that God gives us, we live in the freedom that God gives us, nothing can take that joy away. Nothing can cause us to break into despair, and nothing can operate in a way that causes us to live in hate. We can only live in that love. And that needs to be recovered too. I know times are dark, but we need to live within the love that God gives us and within a joy that no one can take. Kathryn, I'm reminded even of Hedi, I believe it's Hedi Elysium, that Father Jacques Philippe talks about. And she was a Jewish woman who was persecuted in Nazi Germany. And she has beautiful writings about, despite suffering from that extraordinary evil, which needed to be destroyed, which needed to be annihilated, that was a cry that calls out to the heart of God for justice, right? A crime that calls out to the heart of God for justice. Even in that despicable evil that she should never have to have lived within, she experienced the peace and the joy of Christ. And so no matter what circumstances we may face, we as Christians, we as Jews, we as people of goodwill, need to live in the joy of God and that freedom that no one can take from us. Too many have lost that today, and that's part of the problem.
We let things enslave us, and that's the biggest danger. And I always think of the persecuted Christians in Iraq and Syria. And there's one woman who was being interviewed who said that she prays for ISIS. She had to leave people in ISIS. She had to leave her home with her family in Mosul. And she was in a refugee camp, or actually not a refugee camp. She was in a church in Erbil that had set up temporary housing for people. And she said, I thank God for ISIS. And you're like, what? And she says, because before she had to take a stand for Christ, she didn't realize how much Christ mattered to her and how grateful she was to God. And so she prays for conversion and she forgives, and I'm really struck by the number of people who find themselves in these terrible situations, but they're freer than most of us.
Yeah, that's so true. I think that the Christian identity that we have, that allows us to endure in the love, the truth, the freedom, the beauty of God, and despite the most challenging circumstances. And we know that God can bring life out of death. He did that on the cross. He did that through the crucifixion. He still brought life out of death. He can bring life out of the most extraordinary and evil circumstances. We see this, that's the story really of the African diaspora into the United States, of slavery, of what my ethnic heritage, my people went through in the United States. Hundreds of years of slavery, remarkably evil conditions, total subjugation, absolutely awful, right? Things that I can't even imagine. But yet, for the African-American people in the United States, we persevered because of the freedom of the love of God in our hearts, because we understood and knew the gospel, we understood Christ in a particular way. And despite our slave masters enslaving us, trying to rip our dignity out of us, we maintained the freedom of the children of God. And you see that in the words of King. You see that in the words of so many other civil rights leaders. You see that even in the writings and the words of Harriet Tubman. That's who we are, a people that persevered despite the most unbelievable evil, because we knew that we were a chosen people through the love and the sacrifice of God. And we have to move out into that reality. We have to reclaim that heritage and move into that reality. And that's how we win. That's how we all win.
So first of all, I want to encourage people in the audience to send your questions in the chat box if you're on Zoom. Louis, one of our questions that we do have is, why did the civil rights movement move from the message of Martin Luther King to what we have today? And with that, I want to add, you have written, you wrote an essay over the summer called A New Birth for American Civil Rights. How can that happen?
Sure. I think that, with the shift that we saw after Dr. King, I think two things I can say quickly there. The civil rights movement in the United States, even if you go into the antebellum period before the Civil War and look at the abolitionist movement, and I think that there's a line from the abolitionist movement into the civil rights movement of the 20th century. And chiefly, not entirely, but chiefly, this was a movement of people of faith in the United States that were seemingly hopelessly protesting, advocating against slavery, that were protesting and advocating against discrimination and Jim Crow segregation, out of an understanding that an unjust law is no law at all, as Dr. King said in his letter to a Birmingham jail. They understood the human dignity of enslaved Africans and of the African American people because of their faith tradition. That is really the foundation for the civil rights movement in the United States. Unfortunately, there have been grave attacks on the foundation of that civil rights movement, such as that foundation stone is starting to wither a bit, more than a bit. It's starting to really wither, and I think that there's an effort to try to claim that socialist policies and theories are consistent with the American civil rights movement, and they're not. There's an effort to suggest that atheistic secularism or transgenderism is somehow consistent with the American civil rights movement, and it's not. And so The only way that the civil rights movement in the United States can continue to be successful is if it continues to be founded upon that Judeo-Christian worldview of the dignity of the God-given dignity of the human person, founded in the truth of who that person is as created in the image and likeness of God. And so I could go on about that first one. On the second question, can you remind me again?
How do we get to this new birth for American civil rights that you've
Yeah, I think two things. I think there's four things we need to focus on as a country. This was true before 2020. It's even more true as we're in 2021. I think healthcare is a massive part of our reality that we live day in and day out as human beings and as Americans. And having a healthcare system that puts the human person and the patient at the center, and that does everything possible to protect their health and dignity is vital. We do not have that right now. Too much of the healthcare that one receives in this country is based on your color. It's based on even more so on your income. It's also based on your demographic and where you live. That's a massive problem, right? I do believe that out of the right to life, there's a right to medical care. There's a human right to medical care out of that right to life. Now, that doesn't mean, and I do not believe that the government should guarantee that through some massive universal system. I think a universal healthcare system would actually be gravely problematic for the dignity of the human person. But we need a healthcare system that empowers each patient to have their health, their dignity protected and respected, and put the patient with their family as the key decision maker in their healthcare, to allow them, to empower them to be free to receive the best possible quality healthcare that they can get. So that's absolutely needed. And we need to come against healthcare inequality in our nation. Living in DC, where I live, and living within the social networks that I live in, I remember the first few weeks of COVID, and it was like living in an alternate universe where those that were a little bit well off, good friends of mine who I love dearly, there was an experience of it being almost an extended vacation, which is fine, but while being on the phone with my mother, who lives in the Detroit area, about all of these people that she knew, largely African Americans that were in the hospital with COVID, some that died from COVID, and just seeing what the Black community went through in the early weeks of COVID in the Detroit area was absolutely devastating. And it made me angry. And it's not that it's my friend's fault in DC who are kind of in the early stages were enjoying it as an extended vacation. That's not their fault, but it just shows you about what we have in this country, where poor, sometimes communities of color are more susceptible to public healthcare crisis, and that shouldn't be that way. So we need to have a patient-centered healthcare system that is particularly targeted to support the poor and the vulnerable. We need to have greater equality of access to medical care. We need to have greater access of primary care, particularly to poor communities in our nation. And we also need to do the same. It's not just the African American community, but it's also rural communities, particularly that are predominantly white. It's also Hispanic communities, making sure that they have the care, the access to education, the access to health and wellness and nutrition that they should have. I would say, so that's the healthcare system. I think the need for criminal justice reform, we still have too many incidents of racial bias in our country, too many instances of police brutality. We're not where we should be. We've advanced in great ways, even since I was in college, which was less than 20 years ago. We've made massive advances, but we're not where we need to be when it comes to criminal justice reform, when it comes to instances of racial bias in our criminal justice system. I also think free speech, I don't talk about that much, but maintaining free speech in our country, and I don't want to get into that too much, but free speech is really important. Also religious freedom. Religious freedom is vital in our educational system. So many Black families, Hispanic families, very much seek the discipline and the virtue that's provided in a Catholic or faith-based education. So many families, and particularly African-American families, I know this through a family member that works on some of these issues, seek the amazing care they get at a truly Catholic medical system. Over 20%, and I believe it's over 22%, around 22%, I should say, 22% of American healthcare comes from a Catholic healthcare institution. We cannot and could not handle this public healthcare crisis. We would not have the capacity to handle COVID-19 without the amazing healthcare we get from the Catholic healthcare system. Just wouldn't happen. We wouldn't have the capacity. We'd be out of luck. We'd be out of time. And so we got to protect religious freedom in our educational system. We have to protect religious freedom in our healthcare system, not just because so many lives are dependent upon it, but because this is a fundamental right that is so much of the basis of why this country was founded and so much of the basis of human freedom, human flourishing, and civil rights in America. Religious freedom, Kathryn, as you know, ultimately protects the right of people to love and care for others in the United States. If we don't protect that right, everything else collapses, particularly in the healthcare space.
Your point about Catholic medicine, Catholic education is so true. And there's a parish in Washington, D.C. in Anacostia, St. Thomas More, and the majority of those students, Black students, are not even Catholic. Their lives are being saved by that school being in existence. And as you were saying, in that area, food was a problem at the height of the pandemic,
right.
And it remains a problem. And having that pantry there that doesn't just serve Catholics is really makes all the difference for some families. And what's always striking to me about that parish in particular is it's in DC, but it's in the area of DC that the power brokers never have to go to, you know,
right.
And it's really criminal that we don't really, you know, so often we don't see the faces of the people that we're talking about, you know, and this all goes back to, you know, what Christ tells us to do, and encountering the human person with love, appreciating that they were created by God for love and to be loved, you know, as much as the most pious person, right? And or the most saintly person, you know. And that's so important to bear in mind, and it's essential for the country. You know, as we're saying, things are falling apart because we're not approaching life and politics and everything else with love. Tim asked, could one say that the difference between the civil rights direction during the civil rights era and that of today is that the strength to love, specifically as highlighted by Martin Luther King Jr., to love one's enemies has been abandoned? And I think the answer is absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's huge. And that's exactly what we're talking about. It doesn't mean you tolerate the evil, you reject the evil, but you still love the person.
And do you think that's possible?
100%. I think 100% it's possible.
It probably requires turning off the television, you know, for obviously I want people to be informed about the news because you know, that's what I do, you know. Please keep reading a National Review. But when we're constantly seeing what's wrong, you know, it does make you start thinking that all of life is what you're hearing, what everyone's talking about right now. And it's not. And we're not going to be judged on, you know, what our opinion was about, you know, a president's tweet or whatever it is that we're talking about.
Right. And so we have to call out evil, right? We have to call out evil and evil actions. And evil is not, it should not be tolerated. It should not be accepted. But we have to tolerate, and not just tolerate, but actually love the person. We have to love the person. And, you know, we have a choice as individuals and in our communities to either persevere in love, which is what we're made for, and which is the only thing that can free and liberate us, or to be enslaved by our hatred for ourselves and hatred for others. That's the choice. That's the stark choice that each of us have as an individual, as a citizen, as a participant in the community, and as a part of this nation. That's the choice our country faces. That's the choice we face as citizens. We have to choose. If we want to be free, the only path is love.
So does it really, really matter if I, individual person, am make it a point to not hate Donald Trump or not hate Joe Biden or not hate whoever it is that we're so concerned about?
It absolutely matters. I think about Senator Robert Kennedy, who was not perfect and had his issues, but I think he did a lot of good in our country. And he talked at a Day of Affirmation speech in South Africa about just that one ripple in the water, a ripple of hope, right? And it may sound trite and it may sound hokey, but it's true. That one good act that one can do, that rejection of the hatred for one's neighbor, the hatred for someone, whether it's on the television set or in the White House or my next door neighbor, what have you, it creates a ripple effect. It creates a ripple effect that, in his words, if I'm remembering correctly, can become a mighty stream, right? And in the aggregate, it's huge. And so it matters big time. And you know what? You know why it matters even beyond that? It's the one thing we can control, right? It's the one thing we can control. Whether we're in the midst of extraordinary suffering or extraordinary consolation, we can only control what's in our sphere of influence, and we can really control ourselves. And so it's that humility to say that I have what's in front of me, and I'm going to do good, and I'm going to choose love, and I'm going to reject evil just with what's in front of me and what God has given me today.
It's asked, so how do we get more people to love each other? And the answer is what you just answered. It's do it yourself.
Right. The witness, right? Politics has its place. And we should seek justice and the common good in our political, in our politics in the United States. But the witness and the doing good, the good that we can do with what God has given us, it's a humbling act. But who would have thought Mother Teresa could have done what she did? Who would have thought that Lech Walesa, from what I understand, an unemployed electrician, could have brought down the Soviet Union in Poland? Who would have thought that a preacher from Georgia in his late 20s could have done what he did? I see day laborers and I see young mothers who are clearly not from they're Hispanic and mostly speak Spanish, and from what I can tell, clearly not from the United States. And when I see these people, particularly when I'm going to church in Northern Virginia, I am inspired and amazed by the hard work and the love that many of these immigrants in the United States, however they got here, the work ethic, the virtue, and the love and that they have for their spouses and for their children. And I say that not in a paternalistic way, but in true admiration and inspiration. The love that they do every day, the self-sacrifice, you can see the weariness on their face, but a sense that this is what they're made for, a sense of duty, and a sense that they are free. The joy that I see on their faces, and this is around St. Rita's in Arlington, is extraordinary. And who knows the amount of good, the amount of sacrifice, the heroic nature of what I think a lot of these families do day in and day out. I can only imagine. And that is the Holy Family. In a lot of these families, I see the Holy Family. And who would have thought that this little family in the kingdom of Judea that no one knew and no one had ever heard of would change the entire world. And that's the opportunity I believe that God gives each of us every day.
Peter asks, do you feel that one way of loving people is to leave them space to take responsibility for their lives?
Yeah, I think so. I think so, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to pray through that. But again, it's a sense of humility. There's a sense of greatness, right? That we've been given so much so we can do something about the injustice that we may see. But it's also a discernment about that which we can't do and respecting the freedom of that person, even perhaps to make choices that harms themselves. And that's a question of discernment, but that humility to do great things, to strike out for people at great cost, but also the humility to say that, you know what, I actually can't do anything in this situation, and to discern that.
And I find this on the streets of Manhattan often. I always want to fix things, and I can't fix things. Most things I can't fix. And, I've had situations where I try to get help for the person and get them to Catholic Charities, and I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's that she doesn't want the help, or there's obviously something more that I don't understand. And at a certain point, I have to appreciate that, maybe God just has me here to be looking her in the eye and listening to her story. But it goes back to that first principle of just loving and knowing that, we are not the savior.
Right.
And I think that's so important when we look at political issues too, because, no politician is going to be the savior, and no one policy is going to be the saving grace for everyone. Obviously, these things are important. But the love is the most important part. And are you approaching the politics from that place? Are you
Right.
approaching your neighbor, as you were saying, your neighbor from that place? Gene has a question that he's put in there a while ago, so I want to go to. He says, I heard a long talk about Martin Luther King yesterday, and I asked the speaker if real change was possible without change of hearts resulting from spiritual renewal. And she gave what I thought was a very weak answer. She contended that men of goodwill can negotiate change if we just have enough education. How would you respond?
I think it's both. I think that call to daily conversion that each of us have to, seek the face of God every day and seek the love of God for those around us and our families and our neighbors and those we work with is the number one. It's truly the number one, and it's the priority. Priority isn't multiple things; it's one thing. That's the one thing: love of God and neighbor. If I get that wrong, my life's a failure. Period. I could save the world 20 times over, but it's a failure. On the second level, I think that politics, the laws in our city, in our county, in our state, at the federal level, they do really make a difference. They do impact lives. And I've spent, as flawed as I am, I spent so much of my time advocating for laws and policies that protect the dignity of the human person, the unborn, protecting religious freedom, protecting the poor and vulnerable. So that's vital and necessary, but it has to be placed in its proper context. And there's a temptation that we also must reject to say, well, it's all about personal conversion and that's it, and to stop there. And I think that's not true. That's a call to laziness. It shows a certain lack of courage, and it shows a certain attachment to comfort and ease that we're not called to. But then there's also a temptation to say, well, it's all about the external, it's all about public policy, it's all about the politics of the situation, and it's all about the external social justice in the community. That's also not true either. That either of those two alone in a vacuum, it's not true. We're called to do both. We're called to seek our own personal conversion that of our family, that of our community, right? And to come closer to God and closer to the love that He offers. But we're also called to create structures, create a civilization of love and justice through law, through policy. The two have to be married together. If you cut one off, they're not. It's not real. It's not authentic. And it's easier to just do one or the other. But we have to do both, myself included. I often get caught up in too much of, sitting in, if I'm in the adoration chapel, as a friend of mine once said, if I'm in the adoration chapel and the man outside's car is on fire and it's burning, and I say, oh, well, I have to pray, there's a problem. If on the other hand, I'm about to, charge into the lion's den without, of some particular problem that's not absolutely an urgent emergency, that's all on me, and I don't consult the wisdom from above, there's also a problem. I have never, every time I've tried to try to act as though it's all up to me, and don't consult, don't seek grace, it always fails. Every time I say I can do nothing without your grace, that my weakness is made perfect by God's grace, extraordinary things happen. And so we as Christians, people of goodwill, people that have faith, we need to operate also in that reality as well.
And gratitude is a big part of that, as you were talking about earlier. Frequently, and I think this changes one's attitude toward people, toward how we look at policy. I see so many people on the streets, and I just think there, but by the grace of God go I. One of the lessons of this last year has been we're all vulnerable, and
right.
There's no any security you feel is false security, right?
Right. Right.
The great Mark Rogers asks, are there any practical, tactical recommendations to rebuild social capital to counter polarization?
Yeah, I think the witness aspect of things, I think institutions that are steeped in Judeo-Christian worldview and a real commitment to, particularly to the gospel, that are directly caring for people is really important. And I think particularly in urban areas and rural areas, it needs to be seen, because St. John Paul II, we all know that he was an actor, and but he understood how to make grand gestures. I think of the assassin. I sometimes think of this, the would-be assassin that attempted to kill him early on in his pontificate. And he made sure that the cameras were there. I'm assuming that he made sure that the cameras were there, that the world could see what Christian forgiveness looks like. And so many of us may struggle with a question, is this, am I, in showing the world and showing my community what I'm doing, am I acting out of pride? Am I trying to thrust myself up front? But I think that I even think of Samwise Gamgee in The Lord of the Rings, which I'm reading right now for the first time. He talks about a moment where, no, he's been thrust to the fore. It wasn't he that thrust himself, but some type of power had thrust him, some type of good power had thrust him to the forefront to act. And so whether we can be in New York City or in Boston or Detroit or Washington, D.C., providing that daily witness, a weekly witness to what the love of God looks like for those that are poor and vulnerable, and letting others see it, that can't help but penetrate the heart. And I think that is particularly important now.
I think super practically, if we're Christians, we need to have a routine. We have some tool where we do a daily examination of conscience. We take a look at the Beatitudes. What have I done that reflects the Sermon on the Mount today? What more can I do? These questions, and that important discerning as you were talking about, what are my motivations here? Is it, you know,
Right.
I want more followers on Twitter? Is it, because I'm looking at my branding, is it
Right.
because I want somebody to be impressed by me?
Right.
Or is it this humility and love? And I'm going to give you the last word because we've gone a little over, because we could have this conversation forever, and but we have to get to work, right? So, Louis, just your final thoughts about what in the reality of there are things to be concerned about, and there are evil things in our midst, and there continues to be racial injustice and all kinds of other injustices. How do you think Martin Luther King would be advising us today?
I think that he would say that we all should live in the freedom of the love of God for his children. I think that's where he would go today. That we operate not on human terms, but in the terms of the eternal, and that the ends never justify the means. And too many have forgotten that. The ends never justify the means, and nothing ever. I think he would be extraordinarily angry, have a righteous anger by the evil that happened at the Capitol on January 6th. I also think he would be very angry by the violence that happened earlier in the year, the rioting in other places throughout the country. And he would say that we must absolutely reject violence, that in seeking justice, the ends never justify the means, and that we must seek true justice that elevates human freedom for all people, that also avoids becoming what we hate. And we cannot seek justice. We cannot seek the common good through means that, unbeknownst to us, cause us to become the very thing that we hate. And so he would, I think, ask people to step back. I think he would ask Christians to think with the mind of Christ and not the spirit of the age. That's what I hope he would say.
Well, and I keep looking at this cross and thinking, that's A, this is what violence does, and B, this is what love looks like,
Right.
And
Right.
so we're not promised that it's all going to be pretty and comfortable and secure.
Right. And I think too, Kathryn, he would say, just like he said, long life has its place. He said that in his last sermon. I think he would also say politics has its place, and that we must keep our eyes fixed on Christ and fixed on the eternal city. He did not call us to King did not call us to some utopia here in the United States. He called us to a much better country. But he ultimately called us to the heavenly city. And that's what we're seeking. And that's what he sought, and that's what he died for. And that's what the saints that he quoted in a letter to a Birmingham jail sought. They sought the eternal city of the eternal city of God, the eternal city of the love of God, that Aquinas and that St. Augustine so directed us all to. And I think that's what he would say.
And if we want politics to be better, we have to be better.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, starting with me.
Starting with me. Yeah, absolutely. Preaching to myself. Thank you so much, Louis Brown. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you don't mind that we kept you a little over. Thank you for the people who stuck with us, and thank you, people who will be watching this later. I'm always grateful for your time, Louis, and I'm always grateful to the National Review Institute for letting us do things like this. Yeah, thank you, and God bless everybody.
God bless you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.